All right, everybody, welcome back to the Western Rookie Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Johnson. And as you can tell by the crazy background and the lack of episodes that I have put out in the last couple weeks, I have had a knee replacement surgery, and I don't like walking all the way up to my office, which is up a whole bunch of steps. So I brought my studio down to my bedroom, and I'm recording this episode from my bed. And today's guest is Mr. Peter Hackett. Peter, how are we doing today, man?
Good. It's Dr. Peter Hackett.
Dr. Peter Hackett. I apologize for that.
Yeah.
I guess when you've put in enough time to earn it, we should say it, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, they want to know hearing about medical stuff. It ought to be coming from a doctor, I think. Yeah.
Yep. There you go.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely. Dr. Peter Hackett. And, I had this idea, and I wanted to, well, not only did I have the idea, but I also have gone through the experience. I live in Iowa, and I want to chase elk. And one place that you can chase elk is in Colorado. And I've been out to Western Colorado, and I've tried to, I tried to compete at these 10,000 plus elevation, and it just did not work out. I've been to Idaho. I've been to other states where there's higher elevation, and my body just did not function like it does back here in Iowa. And I felt like I wanted to talk with somebody about that. So I Googled it, and your name popped up. All right. And so I reached out to you, and I'm happy that you responded. So Dr. Peter Hackett, why don't you go ahead and tell us where you live and what do you do for a living?
I live in Colorado. I've been working for many years in Telluride, which is about 9,000 feet. And I currently live on a ranch at 7,200 feet and got a lot of elk on my ranch. I'm an emergency physician, but I spend most of my career doing studying and treating high altitude illness. So I'm a climber, and I've climbed all over the world and done a lot of research, mostly on high altitude illness and acclimatization, which is what we'll talk about.
Okay. All right. And so what led you to becoming the expert? Like, talk to us a little bit about how you got to where you're at today.
Yeah. Well, in my youth, I started with backpacking in the mountains. I fell in love with the mountains, although I was from the flatlands of Chicago, and I worked my way out west, did some medical training in San Francisco. And then my first job actually was doing helicopter rescues and firefighting in Yosemite National Park, which was a fabulous job. Yeah. Didn't pay anything, but it was really fun. And I started climbing there more. And then I decided to combine my profession, which was emergency medicine, with my passion, which was being in the mountains and climbing. Mm-hmm. So I was able to carve out a niche there. And when I started 50 years ago, there was very little known about altitude sickness. And now, of course, it's we've come a long ways. So I've got stuff I can share with you that we didn't know about when I first started.
Gotcha. What led you into being curious about altitude sickness?
I was working in Nepal as a volunteer doctor, and I was accompanying trekkers, and I got to Everest Base Camp, which is at 17,000 feet, and I couldn't believe how everybody in the group seemed to come down with the same virus, the headache, trouble sleeping, some nausea, but there wasn't any fever or chills or sore throat or runny nose. And suddenly it dawned on me, this must be altitude sickness. We didn't know much about altitude sickness back in the 70s. So that really piqued my curiosity. And I realized I was in a situation where I could collect data, and it would be unique data that hadn't been previously published. So that's what really started my career.
Okay. All right. So let me just ask you this flat baseline question then is, what is altitude sickness?
Yeah. Now, I should preface that by saying what really piqued my curiosity was that perfectly normal, healthy, young, vigorous people could go to altitude and get very sick and even die.
Yeah.
For no fault of their own. So that to me was like, whoa, what's going on here? So altitude sickness refers to this syndrome that develops during the period of adjusting to the altitude. You could call it altitude adjustment syndrome too. And it doesn't affect everybody, but if people go high enough, fast enough, it will affect everybody. So some people are genetically more predisposed to it than others, but everybody will get sick if they go too high, too fast for their own bodies. And that's a problem because everybody's a little bit different. So there's the process of acclimatization, and then there's the process of altitude illness, which we think of as kind of failed acclimatization. So when you acclimatize, the first thing you notice is your breathing increases. It might be depth that you notice, or it might be rate, or it could be both, and especially with exercise. So if you're carrying a pack going uphill at 10,000 feet, you are going to be short of breath. There's no question about it. On the surveys I do, I always put that question, are you short of breath with exercise at high altitude? If a person says no, I know they're unreliable.
Okay.
Everybody gets short of breath.
So they're lying, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of normal. And heart rate is about 10 to 15% higher than it would be at rest at sea level because the body wants to get more oxygen and more blood to all the tissues. And the blood vessels in the brain dilate, open up to get more blood into the brain. And that causes a headache or a full head. And there's always trouble sleeping, at least not always, but most of the time initially. So some of that is, you can say, is kind of feeling normal when you go to altitude, to be a little short of breath, little fullness in the head, not sleeping so well. And after a few days, that'll generally improve, usually within 2 to 3 days. But for those that are going too high, too fast for their own bodies, they can develop mountain sickness, which is a headache. It can be a pretty bad headache. Sometimes nausea, almost always trouble sleeping, poor appetite, and fatigue. And it can be debilitating, although it's not really dangerous. And it usually goes away in 2 days. Some of your people out there may remember what a bad hangover feels like. It's possible.
Yep.
That's
Yep.
mountain sickness is exactly like a bad hangover. Feels just the same. And it takes about this, it could take a day to go away, 8 hours, 12 hours, kind of like a hangover, or it could take a day longer. And it's usually not that much more serious than a hangover. However, there's a percentage of people that will go on to not have it resolve and will become sicker, more severe headache, maybe some vomiting, and to the point where they just even can't get out of their tent or out of their cot, And those people need to get down or they need medication. And it's not that common to get that severe an illness, but it does happen. And so that's the brain. That's the mountain sickness. That's what we call the brain problem, the hangover. The other kind of altitude illness is with the lungs, and it's called pulmonary edema, where the lungs actually fill up with fluid. We see it in about 1 in every 5 to 10,000 skiers in Colorado. Probably more common in hunters because they carry heavy loads. Skiers don't carry heavy loads. And the more you exert at high altitude, the more likely you are to get it. So here in the Western Slope, one of the ERs I was working in, we used to keep a scoreboard, and we had hunters and elk. And every time somebody came with pulmonary edema, we'd say, score 1 for the elk, -1 for the hunters. That's a serious illness. That can kill people.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
fortunately doesn't happen often. Maybe a couple deaths a year in Colorado and hunters from high altitude pulmonary edema. Nobody knows for sure, but probably not more than a few. But still, a bummer to plan a trip, leave your family, go in the mountains and die for no good reason. So there's things you can do to prevent the condition. The first is get acclimatized. So the problem is that a lot of hunters these days don't respect the time required to adjust to the altitude. So they want to fly straight from Iowa or Chicago or Missouri and they could fly into Gunnison at 9,000 feet, or they could fly into Montrose at 5,600 feet, or even Grand Junction at 4,500 feet. And then the same day, going up to the trailhead, or go into a camp, which is not a good idea. So All the experts, especially me, advise never going from sea level to over 9,000 feet in one day.
Okay.
So that's a really good
Okay.
rule of thumb. Even if you're
See,
flying into Denver, if you just spend a night in Denver before you go up into the mountains, it'll make a big difference. That's how quickly the body is adjusting to the
yeah,
altitude.
yeah. In 2000, I went on my very first ever elk hunt into Idaho. And we got in a car in Iowa. I drove straight to the trailhead. I got out of the truck. I walked up into the mountains, and I was defeated for the rest of the week because I did not take time to acclimate. I learned that lesson. So then the next time, my friend who lives in Montrose, I drove all the way to Montrose. Then we spent 24 hours in Montrose before we headed up to the the trailhead at 10,200 feet. And so we even chilled there for about, I don't know, 8 hours before we spent the night and then went up. And that's a lesson that I've had to learn the hard way. Even
Yeah.
even way before that, when I tried to climb Mount Evans one year, I got nauseous. I started throwing up. I was not doing well because we went right from the bottom all the way to the top in a matter of, just the car ride up there. And it was pretty brutal, and it took me like a day and a half to get over that.
And you raise a good point. If you don't respect the time required and you fall way behind in your acclimatization, you get sick, it could ruin your whole week.
Yeah.
Whereas if you take the
Yeah.
extra time up front, an extra day or day and a half, maybe 2 days, the rest of your week will be a lot better.
Yeah. You mentioned 9,000 feet. Is that where people start to see these types of effects, or is it relative to where they start out at?
Well, both. We use 8,000 feet as the kind of dividing line where people are likely to have an increased risk of mountain sickness. But 9,000 feet is even, the risk goes way up. It's not a linear risk. It's a little hard to explain the physiology, but 9,000 and higher is much riskier than 8 to 9,000. And of course, it matters where you start up. If you live in Denver, you won't get sick. You can go up to 9 or 10,000 in one day. But if you live under 4,000 feet, you're at increased risk. And the best thing you can do is come out a couple days before the hunt and hang out and do some interesting things before you go on the hunt. Sea level people are at greatest risk.
Yeah. What does the body, you've mentioned some of the things already, especially with the lungs and
Yeah.
the brain, but talk to us a little bit about how the body responds to being active at higher elevations.
Yeah. Well, you just can't be as active. So the body, the muscles and the brain don't get enough oxygen at higher altitudes. So it's impossible to do the same amount of work that you could at a lower altitude. I should say aerobic work that requires more than a minute of activity. So if you try to hike with a pack, for example, at the same pace at 9,000 feet that you're accustomed to at low altitude, you'll get exhausted. And it'll also make you more susceptible to mountain sickness. So it's very important to reduce your pace, recognize you just can't move as fast. That's just the way it is. And build in more rest stops and a little more rest time,
Mhm.
and it makes a difference. The Like if you go to 9,000 feet, your exercise capacity is reduced by about 15%.
Okay.
That's a fair amount.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've had a lot of conversations with guys over the years, whether they live out in, Colorado. I keep using Colorado as an example because, I mean, that's where you're going to find some of the highest peaks in, the lower 48. But, talking about physical fitness and preparing for the upcoming hunt. And then we joke around and we say, well, there's nothing you can do. You can work out all you want, but there's nothing you can do that's going to make the transition from, like 1,400 feet where I live to 10,000 feet where the elk are going to be at. Is that an accurate statement, or is there something that people can do to actually prepare their bodies for these higher elevations, and maybe even draw on some of your experience from, overseas in some of the even bigger elevations like Nepal and things like that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Everybody would like to, for example, take a pill and do better
Mhm.
at high altitude before you
Yeah.
come up. Uh, Being fit is really important, even though it's true it doesn't prevent altitude illness. But if you're unfit and it's a real slog to get into camp and you got a headache and your tummy isn't feeling so good, you're not sleeping, you're much more likely to pack it up. Whereas if you're fit, a headache may not bother you so much. You still get into camp, you still feel pretty strong. A little mountain sickness on the side won't bother you as much. The real danger is the young guys who are super fit that can go really fast and think they're immune and therefore race up the mountain. And they're the ones that can really get the sickest and they carry the heaviest packs too, So you got to watch out for the macho or machette person that always wants to be in the front and is always carrying heavy, and because it'll come back to bite them. So what else can you do? Well, there's not a lot, for the higher altitudes, like in Nepal, a lot of the climbers will use hypoxic tents. So what they do is they sleep in these tents that it's got a little oxygen machine that takes oxygen out of the air
Okay.
and pumps nitrogen in. So it simulates high altitude. You're sleeping in a lower oxygen environment. For a hunting trip, I don't think it's worth it. They're kind of expensive to rent. And to really get a benefit, you have to do it for at least a week or two, sleep in the tent for a week or two. You're much better off to go a day or two earlier and give your body time to adjust before really hitting it hard. Diet hasn't been shown to make much of a difference. It's important to stay hydrated when you get to altitude, but not overdo it with the water. Alcohol, do not want to get drunk at high altitude. A beer is okay, maybe two, but no more than that because it depresses your breathing.
How does it do that?
Well, it acts directly on alcohol is a depressant. It acts directly on the
Mhm.
brain, and the respiratory center of the brain is one of the parts of the brain that it depresses. And so after a couple of beers, your oxygen level will be lower. So you want to take it easy with the alcohol. Marijuana doesn't make any difference. And the way we judge any kind of medication or drug at altitude is how it affects the breathing. And the main one is alcohol. What else can you do? There's medication you can take. If you find out that, say you come out with your buddies each year and you're the only one that really gets sick, and it tells you you're more prone, that's just your genetics. You're more likely to get altitude sickness than everybody else. You can take a prescription medication called Diamox. And what that does, it speeds up your acclimatization. And it's like any medicine, it has side effects, but it's pretty well tolerated. But that's something you'd have to get from a doctor or from one of your buddies that got a prescription for it. And you would start it the day before you come out.
How does that work actually? How do you get climatized to an environment faster that you're not in?
Yeah, good question. So during the process, it's all about breathing at high altitude. So when you come up here and you start to breathe more, you blow off carbon dioxide. And as a result, the pH of your blood goes up. And that tells your brain, oops, you're starting to breathe too much. You better slow down your breathing. The kidneys kick in and get rid of that extra, what's called alkalosis. They get rid of the alkalosis and bring your pH more towards normal. And as that happens, your breathing increases more. So it takes 4 days to maximize your breathing at an altitude. Whereas if you take Diamox, it takes less than 1 day because
Okay.
Diamox acts on the kidneys to lower the pH of your blood, and that stimulates your breathing.
Okay.
It doesn't mask symptoms, but it does speed up that process of acclimatization.
Gotcha. So if you were to take that medication, and let's say you suffered from it in the past, and you took that medication and then you came out and maybe you went through a 24-hour climatization process, you would have a better likelihood of not getting sick.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Cool.
It drop your
Cool.
chances by about 50%. Not won't drop them
Nice.
100%. It'll drop them about 50%.
Yeah. And you did, you just said exactly what I've done in the past. My second elk hunt, when I went up to some bigger elevation, I knew I was struggling in that 8,000 and I was going to go even higher this next time. My buddy, who is an anesthesiologist, he was like, why don't you try this? I'm sure it's going to work. And of course it did.
Yeah.
It didn't make me climb up the mountain any faster, but it made me able to like just get to where I needed to be able to move around the mountainside and not be a basically dead weight.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
You want to be able to keep up with your buddies. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, even then, I don't think I did a very good job of keeping up with them. But
Yeah.
when it comes to getting sick, what does your experience tell you when it comes to like knowing maybe when to tough it out and keep trudging up, or
Yeah.
knowing, dude, I got to stop and I got to get some water or some rest?
Yeah. Good. So there are some red flags that you really need to pay attention to. If you got the bad hangover, you might feel miserable enough. You just want to get out of there. That's fine. Going down always works. But you could tough it out. And sometimes if you just tough it out for another 24 hours, it'll clear up. The red flags, there's two red flags. One signals the brain is off. One signals the lungs are off. So the red flag for the brain is you act like you're drunk. I mean, instead of feeling hungover, you feel like you're drunk. Your balance is off. You're kind of woozy and you're not thinking straight.
Right.
That your brain is off. That's a bad sign. That, with altitude sickness, regular mountain sickness, you get headache, you feel crappy, you don't want to talk to anybody. But with the brain edema, the worst kind, you're not quite sure where you are or who your friends are, or you don't remember what's going on, and you can't walk a straight line. You're stumbling. That's a red flag. That person could be unconscious in 12 hours. So they need to get down. And then with the lungs, kind of like anything with the lungs, if you can't breathe, that's a problem.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
shortness of breath while you're climbing a hill is one thing. Everybody's got that. But if you're sitting around the campfire and you're having a hard time catching your breath, that's it. That's abnormal. And then if that progresses, it gets to the point where you're really struggling to breathe. It might look like an asthma attack, but it's really fluid in your lungs that's starting to fill up your lungs. And that's also a red flag.
Yeah. Yeah. And then does it, how do you know whether or not it's just get down to lower elevation or it's time to get to a hospital?
Well, it's,
Does lower elevation solve the problem?
yes, it does.
Okay.
So, but if it doesn't solve the problem, you need to get to a hospital because maybe it's not altitude sickness. Maybe it's a stroke or a heart attack or something else,
Yeah. That was brought on by the stress of altitude sickness.
Yes, could be,
Okay.
or just by high
Yeah.
altitude itself. We have hunters out here all the time that are having heart attacks, but it's not so much the altitude, it's that they're not fit. So they get off the couch to do a hunt at 9 or 10,000 feet. That's a really bad idea. They need to get fit first, at least a couple weeks of hiking. Ideally they should be more fit and then come out here because it's not altitude sickness, but we see heart attacks not infrequently.
Right. Okay. All right. When it comes to how does the body perform, I've been on a kick lately of watching some of these documentaries about Everest, or I believe the last one I watched was about a mountain peak called Myru or something like that.
Meru.
And Meru, yeah. And basically it was about guys who were spending 30 days on a mountain trying to climb to the top of it, and they're sleeping in these plus 15 feet environments or 15,000 feet environments. What happens to the body when you're in extreme elevation like that for like months at a time, or does the body just get used to it?
Body is amazing. It can adapt. Our human bodies can adapt up to about 17,000 feet,
Okay.
but not above that.
What happens after that?
But yeah, when you go higher than that, you're slowly dying, and
Okay.
you got to get up and down before you collapse. So if you're at 26,000 feet, you got maybe 2 days to get out of there, get up and get out. If you're at 20,000 feet, you might have a few weeks, or even longer. But yeah, at 15,000, you can live there for months and not do any long-term damage. It's pretty amazing that the human body has that capacity.
Yeah. Man, that's amazing to watch how these people perform. I look at some of those documentaries and I go, dude, I don't even make it to base camp
Yeah.
on some of these.
Yeah, no, that's right.
What else do hunters or people traveling to go live or explore in higher altitudes and elevations need to prepare for, or tips or tricks or anything that you've learned throughout your research that they need to know?
Well, the number one thing is how quickly you go up and staging your ascent, giving your body time to acclimatize. That's number one. Number two is recognizing the symptoms of mountain sickness and recognizing when you need to really do something about it. It's okay to treat a headache with Advil or Tylenol or something like that. That's fine. And coffee is very good. Coffee
Really?
helps. Yeah, it helps the headache, and it also helps with the fatigue. It's a slight upper. One problem is people who are regular coffee drinkers come to the mountains and they've heard somewhere they shouldn't drink coffee at high altitude. That's a big
Hmm.
mistake. Because if you're used to drinking coffee every day and then you stop, you're going to get a bad headache,
Okay.
and it's going to make altitude worse. So coffee is good. Black tea is good. Caffeine is good in general.
See, that's a myth that I guess I went along with because I was under the impression that you want the most amount of oxygen in your veins as possible. And if I drink coffee, what do they call that? A vasal constrictor. Coffee constricts your veins. So why is that? Why is it
Well,
the
it
opposite?
constricts
Almost have the opposite effect.
caffeine mostly constricts the blood vessels in the head,
Okay.
which is where they're too enlarged at high altitude anyhow. That's why you got the headache. And if you're a regular coffee user, it doesn't have much effect in vasoconstriction. Or in diuresis, people worry that it's a diuretic, it'll dry you out. But that's only for people that don't use coffee and then start using coffee
Yep.
or caffeine. I
Yep.
guess Cokes would be the same.
Hmm.
So anyhow, that's a myth that I like to bust.
Yeah. Dude, that's interesting.
Another myth I like to bust is that being fit is really protective. We already covered that.
Hmm.
Some the hunters will buy these little oxygen cans. They're like $15.
I've seen. Yep. I've seen those.
It's like a buck a breath practically. I mean,
Yep.
there's not much in them,
Yep.
so they're not
Right.
very helpful. When we have a
Okay.
sick hunter come into the emergency department, we got to keep them on. I mean, if they're really sick, we have to keep them on oxygen for 12 to 24 hours, not
Yeah.
5 minutes.
Yeah. Not one breath.
All right. So
Right.
that's something that, and then, so I was saying, recognize the symptoms, know when you need help, know when to come down. Um, a really good outfitter having hunters sleep above 10,000 feet would carry a full-on cylinder of oxygen
Really? Okay.
for emergency use. I mean, they're lightweight aluminum tanks, and they're not expensive to rent. I mean, a really good outfitter will have oxygen just in case. What else? We've covered. Oh, the other thing is a lot of people have pre-existing medical problems like high blood pressure or diabetes or atrial fibrillation. Those people need to think about what's going to happen at high altitude and have a plan for what, if say asthma actually does better at high altitude because the air is thinner and there aren't as many allergens. But if you get an asthma attack at high altitude, you could be in trouble. People they have to know how to deal with their medical condition, anticipate what might happen. and maybe talk to their doctor about a plan for if they do have an exacerbation. The main problem is lung disease, but most guys with lung disease aren't going to be hiking at
Yeah.
9,000 feet.
Right. Does this illness discriminate against more for men or women, or is it equal?
Pretty equal opportunity, yeah. And age too. There's a bunch of studies that show the older people tend to do a little better,
Okay.
but the bottom line is anybody, fit, unfit, male, female, kid, adult, anybody can get altitude sickness. One factor I should mention that's a risk factor is being overweight. Mostly we think because it has to do with the breathing. When you're laying down at high altitude, if you're overweight and you got a lot pushing on your diaphragms, it might be tough to keep your oxygen levels up. So
Yeah.
that's a risk
I
factor.
noticed that. I noticed that the first time I ever slept above 10,000 feet, I felt like something was, and I'm a back sleeper.
Yeah.
So I just felt like something was sitting right on my chest, and I almost had to roll to my side in order to fall asleep because there was less pressure that way. So that was a very sleepless night, that first night up there. Yeah. Yep.
So that's a good point. A lot of people ask about sleeping pills,
Hmm.
which are okay in small doses as long as they don't depress the breathing. So some stuff like benzodiazepines, that's like Ativan and Xanax and Valium. Generally, you want to avoid those at high altitude.
Okay.
But some of the other ones like Ambien, Zopiclone, that's Lunesta, they're safe, but should not be combined with alcohol.
Interesting. Love it. Is there any other information that you think would be helpful for a hunter who's living in the flatlands and wants to come out and hunt in higher altitudes on maybe how to prepare, or any tips or tricks or pieces of equipment that you might recommend?
I think we've covered most of it. Most of it has to do with timing. If a hunter has an opportunity to go frequently into the mountains, of course, that's going to be an advantage. So your
Right.
body does
Right.
retain some degree of acclimatization. So if you're coming out for a hunt in September and then you get a chance to come out again for a week in October, you're going to be a lot better off in October because you came out for a week in September. So that helps a lot. Building an extra day or two into your program just to deal with the altitude
Hmm.
is, that can be hard to do, but it's really worth it. Anticipating potential medical problems if you have medical problems, and then recognizing the illness and when to get help. You know, that's all good. Having an exit strategy, having an in-reach or some form of communication is super important. Nowadays, with the newer phones, you can even connect by satellite and send messages and send your coordinates to 911. So you probably have a whole separate podcast about that. So that's important for planning.
Yep. Perfect. Perfect. Well, Doctor
Yes.
Hackett, I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to hop on and educate us about this. I'll be honest, when I didn't even think about things like this when I went out to Colorado and Idaho for the first time
Yeah.
hunting. And I'm hoping that this information will spark some conversation with some hunting groups that are maybe out east on the East Coast or in the Midwest, and allow them to maybe say, "Hey, dude, I think we need to build in an extra day on the front end to just chill at altitude before we start humping up in the mountains." So I appreciate your insight, your knowledge, and your experience, and thank you very much for taking time out of your day to hop on the podcast. If there is a like a group of people who are listening to this that maybe want to find out more information about your research or what it is that you do, is there a place that we could send them?
Yeah, you could go to my website, highaltitudedoctor.com, I think it is,
Okay.
or just Google Peter Hackett, MD, and it'll come right up.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your time today,
Okay,
and
Dan.
have a good rest of your week.
Good luck with your knee.
Appreciate it.
Happy healing. Okay.